Welcome. It is so great to be together again, live in the same room. This is fantastic to bring together philologists, geneticists, archaeologists, historians, interested people, brilliant economists. We are surrounded by really smart people with really different backgrounds, and that is the essence of the science of the human past and what we're trying to do with the Max Planck-Harvard Research Center. We have a particular joy today to hear from one of the moving spirits behind the Max Planck-Harvard Research Center for the Archaeoscience of the Ancient Mediterranean, which, as many of you know, is pronounced by many people as MHAAM and by me as mayhem. And it really is great to be together. We even have fantastic professors of astrology. Oh, no, it's not that. Being funny, Mike. So the science of the human past, as you know, is something that has existed at Harvard since, I think, 2011. And our goal has been to bring together people who would never otherwise meet and to try and bring the power of the sciences to bear on the great questions of the humanists, the people who are working in the liberal arts and the humanities, to understand our human past in all its splendor and sometimes disappointing detail. We want to create new knowledge by bringing together people who would never otherwise meet. We want to engage students at all levels in this discovery, and so we've had Harvard undergraduates taking a course in science of the human past and going off and being first author with Nick Patterson and David Reich on studies on the migration of the Celts into the British Isles. This is an amazing human and intellectual ferment that is occurring here. We are trying to create, and your presence here helps us see that we're not complete failures, a critical mass of researchers who are interested in reaching across the aisle to their colleagues working in different areas and wrestling with different problems or similar problems with different tools, and in so doing to bridge the gap, to bridge the area between the so-called two cultures of the humanities, the liberal arts, and the sciences. And what better way to try and do that than with the support of our steering committee in the science of the human past, which, as you can see, is drawn from all across the university in terms of divisions and schools, and to do so with the organism that has emerged as an institutional framework out of the science of the human past, this Max Planck-Harvard Research Center, which is virtual. Not a penny is spent on buildings, on structures. It's all in the mind and in the people that we have created as we together, working together, to create a group of researchers and scholars and laboratories and seminars who are addressing the questions of the origins of civilization in Western Eurasia and North Africa around the Mediterranean Sea from the Epipaleolithic forward. And we've been in existence since 2016. We had our first public meeting back in 2017. We are a virtual bridge between Harvard and the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, which, as you probably know, was honored a few weeks ago by a Nobel Prize. And I said to Svante, you should ask me here more often. Good things happen when I'm around. Wish they'd happen here, but we'll keep trying, right, guys? And it allows undergraduates, graduate students, interested people, postdocs to move seamlessly between this hothouse of discovery and innovation that is Harvard University and all its extraordinary human and intellectual and scientific diversity with this extraordinary resources and focused power of the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology and the Department of Archaeogenetics led by Johannes Krause. So here's our leadership team. This is our group of directors. We meet every month, part from Germany, part from the US. We've been using Zoom for a long time before the pandemic to figure out what we're going to do, and some pretty cool things are happening. We actually have been able to raise enough money to have 3 graduate students fully paid for by support, by gifts from people who think this is a good idea. Incremental graduate students within GSAS. Raising money for graduate students is the single most difficult fundraising task at Harvard, as anyone involved with the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences will tell you. So we have 3 wonderful students, 2 of whom are right now working in the laboratories in Leipzig, where I left them, chained to the, no, that's not true, they're having a great time. And the third was to be with us tonight, but she's been exposed to COVID, so Aurora's watching us online. Hi, Aurora. Thank you for being part of this. Our first task is to study the problems of migration and mobility, starting with the background of the Epi-Paleolithic from the ancient DNA and from other markers in the bioremains of the individuals who actually did the moving, the migrating, the intermarrying, and interreproduction. And when we started out in 2016, and then our first real organized meetings in 2017, we were wondering, would we be able to reach Homer? That is the period that Homer was talking about, the Bronze Age. We didn't think so, but we'd give it a shot. Well, we reached Homer and beyond. And now we are moving into classical civilization. Philipp Stockhammer is leading really important research in the biological remains of the people who were classical Athens in the 5th century before our era. Incredible advances can be expected there from the cemeteries of Keramikos, Phaleron. We are deep into the people who were the Roman Empire, as some of the people sitting around here know from the papers they're working on, even as they should be listening to what Philipp Stockhammer has to say. But they'll be listening with one ear, I know. We're working on the diseases they suffered. The picture now of the pathogen of Yersinia pestis, bubonic plague, is completely different, completely and utterly different from what it was in 2016 when MHAAM first began to come into existence. I told one of our wonderfully learned benefactors and supporters that he should take out of this paper the possibility that plague could have been part of the Bronze Age collapse, because we knew that bubonic plague had started in the 6th century and not before. Within a couple years, I was proven completely wrong, as usual, and thanks to the work of MHAAM, we now know that plague goes back very, very far in the past, and MHAAM has helped, the researchers at MHAAM have helped to map that in remarkable detail. And we continue now working on the Black Death and the Justinianic pandemic that played a role in the end of the Roman Empire. We were concerned, and we are concerned, to discover the food they ate. Where did their food come from? What was their food? What was it like? What did it do for them? And in fact, a paper in which Philipp has played a critical role as the senior author has explored, with the work of the laboratory of Tina Warner, our own Tina Warner, the amazing evidence for the import of spices and fine foods from South Asia into the Holy Land in the 2nd millennium BCE. Opening for us new visions of ancient economies, ancient transports, the culture of food in these ancient civilizations. He played an essential role in a paper you may remember by the wonderful Alyssa Mitnick, who's now group director in Leipzig, with a remarkable study of the archaeology, the burial archaeology, and the settlement archaeology of the Bronze Age in the Lech Valley, south of Augsburg in Germany, which revealed the rather stunning fact that all the adult daughters in the pedigrees of the families who were buried in the cemeteries had gone missing. And all the women came from afar that were married into these families and had children there, giving us completely unexpected insights and opening new mysteries for us to attack, new riddles, new questions in the familial and social structure of Bronze Age Europe. So these are the kind of things that Philipp is playing a very important role in. Here's one that's very close to us at Harvard. I had the privilege of visiting the excavations in Ashkelon with our own late Larry Steger, our great Near Eastern archaeologist, in his excavations at Ashkelon, when they had just found some burials that he thought had markers of being from the Sea Peoples, from the famous upheaval period in the Bronze Age in the situation at Ashkelon, and said he was thinking of doing some isotopic work. I said, wait, Larry, there's this guy in Germany named Johannes, and he's got really good abilities in ancient DNA. And the next thing you know, it only took 5 or 6 years, we got the samples going, and the result has been the identification of the genetic markers of the Sea People, which point in a very interesting direction in terms of archaeology and history, led by Michael Feldman, who's played a crucial role as a graduate student and postdoctoral student in our programs here. So today, we're going back to Bronze Age Greece in the excellent company of Philipp Stockhammer, who has had already, in very few years, a quite remarkable career. Going back to, he is presently professor of prehistoric archaeology at the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich. And he is one of our directorial group, as you saw, in the Max Planck-Harvard Research Center. He got his PhD at the University of Heidelberg and then did his Habilitation in Switzerland at the University of Basel. And he is now, as I said, the professor of archaeology. His research projects are amazing, and his knowledge of the Bronze Age is, to me, awe-inspiring across the whole Bronze Age, from the Lech Valley to the Near East, up into the Caucasus. He says he has no competence in the Caucasus. I don't believe him. His familiarity, his intimate familiarity with the ephoreas of modern-day Greece and the archaeological bureaucracy is very impressive, very impressive. His research projects are extraordinary. He's got a number of ERC grants, which are fabulous multi-million-dollar grants to do giant research projects, including on my social being, right off of Twitter or something, Mycenaea's social belonging from an integrative bioarchaeological perspective, or his computer games that he has designed with gamers to spread knowledge, like Bronze Age Live. So Philipp is a man of very, very many parts who has explored many areas and is a wonderful companion as we go forward into this world of new discoveries. Without further delay, let me introduce Philipp Stockhammer. Welcome him, please, to hear what he has to tell us about family, foods, and health in Bronze Age Greece. New light from MHAAM, I mean.
Thank you so much. Mike, thanks so much for the introduction. Thank you all for being here. It's so wonderful to be again in person in Harvard. It's so wonderful. Too much time has gone by since I was here for the last time, and only when you come back in person you see what you really missed in these years that have been virtual only. And today I want to show you a little bit after we left. I personally Harvard a few years ago before the pandemics. I'm so happy to now present you what we have done as part of MHAAM in the recent years, and I want to focus especially on Greece because we have some papers that have recently been published or that are going to be published soon, where I think that have the possibility to shed a new light on family, foods, and health in Bronze Age Greece. So I'm conservative in the sense that I first want to give you a short outline of what I'm going to tell you about, and then I'll drag you into the three main questions of my talk. I first want to tell you a little bit what is the historical background, because I assume not everyone in the room knows Bronze Age Greece, and the same is true that I will give you a very short introduction into the bioarchaeological approaches, just that we are all on the same track so that you can then follow me on my aim to give answers or provide new insights into the question about social belonging, mobility, and nutrition and health in the Aegean Bronze Age. This year, in the year 2022, we celebrate in Germany the 200th birthday of Heinrich Schliemann. We don't know how much we can celebrate. He also destroyed a lot of things, but what he could do, he had really good people in his team. Something that we should always be aware that it's not only you, but it's the good people that you have in your team that make your work successful. And Heinrich Schliemann excavated, as among others, also the famous grave circle A of Mycenae, and the rich finds then helped to shape the name Mycenaean Greece. And his colleague Arthur Evans at the same time excavated in Crete and Knossos, who then shaped accordingly, after following the famous mythical King Minos, the term Minoan Crete. So neither Mycenaean nor Minoan are ancient terms. So it's not that they have no self. We don't know how people in the Aegean Bronze Age named themselves. If they understood themselves as one entity, probably not. But we need to be aware that these terms, Mycenaean and Minoan, are modern designations for archaeological cultures. And it's not clear to what extent they really represent communities of practices or group identities, whatever this means, in the Bronze Age Aegean. However, it shaped our terminology. And this is important because if I use these terms just that you can follow me, the Bronze Age in Greece is roughly the 3rd and 2nd millennium, and archaeologists usually make things into 3 parts, early, middle, late. This is something very, I don't know why, usually 3 parts, sometimes 4, but 3 are more common. So the same happened, of course, to Bronze Age Greece, so we have early, middle, late Bronze Age. And on the mainland, we speak of early Helladic, middle Helladic, and late Helladic. And on Crete, early Minoan, middle Minoan, late Minoan. But what confuses generations of students is that Mycenaean Greece is only the late Helladic period. So when we speak about Mycenaean Greece, it's only the last phase, the late Bronze Age on the Greek mainland, from around 1600 to 1050. This time was dominated by the coexistence of several palaces from Pylos, Mycenae, Tiryns, Athens, and other places, and it's so far quite unclear what was the relationship between these palaces. They were strict administrative systems. At the head of the palace was a king called Vanax in the Linear B tables. They have a writing for administrative purposes, but the social order is still unknown also because I think the Linear B reads as exciting as shopping lists, you know, because it's not, I know it's frustrating, but it's good for me because I can always argue why I never have the incentive to learn Linear B, you know, because there are more, how do you say, other periods of this time had more, how do you say, delightful ways of narrating their life. Linear B is a rather, how do you say, reduced way of writing, in the sense of what it tells us about the life of those people. So how was life in the Bronze Age Aegean? And I already marked that I will present a lot of unpublished studies, so please enjoy, but don't tweet. And what I'm presenting is a comprehensive bioarchaeological approach in order to understand human mobility, food, and social belonging. My aim is always to integrate all these different approaches from archaeology, contextual archaeology, via different modes of bioarchaeological studies, from ancient genetics via proteomics and other approaches. And then the last thing that Mike already said is I'm very much focusing also on transferring this knowledge to societies by developing educational computer games, for example, for school children, so that they learn about learning by playing. You know, how could you bring children in times of pandemics to learn something? I think one of the things that what can help is giving them, they play games anyway, and at least they play something where they can learn something. So this is the aim of the two games that I produced. And I always speak of, when I say I produced, and I did this research, but it's not me. You need to imagine a large group of scholars behind me, and it's completely unjust to say I am the one who did this research. It is only possible because I have a wonderful, absolutely great colleagues, people in my group with whom without them I could never present what I'm doing here. And a large number of local archaeologists and archaeologists all over that have helped us to interpret the context, gave us access to material. And for me, it's important to make clear what I present today is a joint initiative. Yes, I have been involved very prominently, but in the end, it's something that only became possible because of a large number of wonderful people. And Mike, of course, you're one of them, you know, with whom I worked together in the last years. So what did we do? So we did, I will speak today about 3 different bioarchaeological approaches. We speak about human DNA. The world leading specialist is sitting here in the audience, that is extracted and sequenced from the inner ear petrous bone normally, because this is the best DNA preservation. You can also do it from teeth, but petrous bones work best. I will also speak about pathogen DNA that we extract from the tooth dentine here, because for me it's still a miracle how traces of bacteria DNA can survive over the millennia from blood traces inside this dentine after a human being had died out of infectious disease, because then enough pathogens accumulate in the blood and they can be traced 1,000 years later if the genetic preservation allows us to do so. And the last thing that I will speak about are food traces in dental calculus. Dental calculus are the bacteria in your mouth that from time to time decide to petrify. And in this moment of petrification of these bacteria, they include lipids, molecules, and proteins of what you have in your mouth. And when I give this lecture, I always advise that you should stop brushing teeth, because this really destroys unique archaeological material for future generations. So be aware that your tooth hygiene basically will make these studies impossible in 2,000 years. So just think if you want to do something for good for future archaeologists and stop brushing teeth. No, don't take me too serious. With regard to ancient DNA, we should also be aware that it's a very, very complicated process, but one of the key things that happened in the last years that made these analyses possible was what we call DNA capture, that you concentrate the DNA that you're interested in, being human or pathogen or whatever, in your sample and then sequence it, which enables us to get it to resolution with which we can work, which gives the results that I will speak today about. What we see here is the so-called principal component analysis. For some of you, this is something that I deal with on a daily basis. Others maybe see this for the first time. But you must be aware that every point on this map is a human being. And closeness of points means closeness of genetic patterns. So this means I cannot move on such a graph, but if one partner comes from the Caucasus and the other one from Sardinia, roughly the child would be in the middle of this graph. So I cannot move, but points move by offspring with parents from different ancestries. But what is interesting, if you look, there are names of regions, Southeast, Central, Iberian Peninsula, Sardinia, Near East. And it's interesting to some extent that the similarity and dissimilarity of genes mirrors geographical relatedness and closeness. The logical thing is that you rather have offspring with people that are close to you, where it's rather not so probable that you always have offspring with people that are not so close to you. So this is rather logic. But this traveling points on a PCA give us the possibility to understand genetic changes over time. And if we go back to the beginning of the Holocene, 10,000 years ago, we see that none of the population that lived then in Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean really fitted to modern day signatures, which are now gray in the background. And of course, you can say something about ancestry, but you can also genetically say something about biological relatedness. So we can say something about the biological aspect of relatives. Of course, this doesn't mean something social, but the crucial thing is that both are two sides of a medal. So social belonging, of course, is constituted on the one hand by biological factors and on the other hand by social factors. And I think people tend to overemphasize either the one or the other, and I think they're both sides of the same medal, and both have the potential to influence social belonging and should be taken into consideration. So what about the social belonging of the Aegean Bronze Age? And the focus of our study was the study of human remains from collective burials. You know, a chamber grave where you have whatever, 150 or 20 individuals buried together in the same stone chamber or shaft grave. So it's clear that collective burials are the expression of social belonging. If you put people together in the same burial, we assume that they had some belonging during lifetime. But how is this belonging constituted? Is it constituted by biology or by eating together or by living together or having the same origin? We don't know. We can only speculate. But what we can do is now we can at least see with different methods if food, if mobility, if genetic ancestry or genetic relatedness played a role. And at the same time, it is the moment of burying someone in such a chamber that also constitutes belonging among the community. So the community and the social structure is also constituted in the moment when one of the members is buried, because this is the moment where the community becomes aware of the social structures inside the community. So let's give you a first case study, which is from the site of Mygdalia. Pity that it's so bright, so this you can see Greece only very roughly. But you can see, so we are in the northern Peloponnese. And here in Mygdalia, I present the result of, they had 4 houses, and under each house in the courtyard was a shaft grave. And in this shaft grave, they only buried children that had died at a perinatal age. And as there are 4 houses and each has a shaft grave with children that died at a perinatal age, I assume that these are the children that were born by the people living in this house and buried by the respective inhabitants of this house. So we studied one shaft grave with altogether 8 children that died. 7 individuals had really good DNA preservation, and they date to the, let's say, 16th, early 15th century. So we turned them into a biological pedigree, and you see the individuals that we have are only those with the filled symbols, whereby the squares are males and the circles are females. So we have no adults. They were probably buried in the chamber tomb exactly outside the cemetery, and I would love to get access to these chamber tombs to correlate the chamber tombs from just outside the settlement with the 4 shaft graves, you know, under each of the buildings inside the settlement. So what do we see? There must have been a parental generation that we don't see. Pointer doesn't work on this. So the upper 2 here, we don't see them. And then they had at least, what you can see are 4 different children. They had 3 boys. And they had 1 girl. The girl, which is Mygdalia II, died at a perinatal age. The 3 boys survived, and these 3 boys then had offspring with women, and some of them also died at an early age. And it's interesting to see, so obviously these 3 boys stayed at the house, which you might argue maybe they also had some daughters that reached adulthood and had to leave. We don't know, we can't see this. But what we see is that they had this man had children with 2 different women. We cannot say if this was subsequently or at the same time. We can see this. But what is really interesting for me is that we have 1 child, which is the child of the sister of one of the women that came inside as a marital partner into the farmstead. So it's not, so it means that what we see here in this people living together in this household, it's much more complex than just having a core family living together. What we see here is an extended family where even the sister of one of the marital partners that came into the farmstead lived with the family and had there a partner and had their offspring, at least 1, because this is the one that died.
How big is the house?
These are traditional courtyard houses. So you have a big courtyard and you have 5 to 6 rooms around. I would now lie maybe 30 by 40 meters, 40 by 50 meters.
Okay. I was wondering how all these people would fit in, but not a big problem.
No, and probably many of these houses were also 2-story, although I really don't know if all part were 2 stories or not. So I would, but this gives you a rough idea how big the house was. So this is one example that already shows us that life can have been more complex than we thought, especially when it comes to what we usually term family. Let me show another example, and there we go on the Greek islands of Aegina, of Paros, and on Crete. Aegina, Paros, and Crete. And for this, I need shortly to refer to a method that was developed by Harald Ringbauer here at Harvard, a method that deals by comparing inside the genome of one individual. You can see by so-called runs of homozygosity if the parents of an individual were genetically related, which is interesting because you can then see if you get half of your genome from your father, half from the mother, and normally it should be completely different unless mother and father are biologically related. And on this degree, you can see at what distance mother and father were biologically related. So what you see here is from modern times here to right Druze and Jordanian societies, and from past times, you see these big reddish things. They appear when their parents were, for example, related. They were siblings or cousin-cousin. So these here points to cousin-cousin marriage here, which is very typical for Druze societies. It's also in large parts of present-day Islamic societies. It doesn't exist, for example, in the Canaanite Bronze Age. And the little blue, dark blue, indicates how big is the number of people that constituted basically the community of which offspring came off. But for me now, it's the large reddish columns that are of interest. And the interesting thing is what we see is that there are a large number of data sets that have been produced, but no society in the past world had such an intense mode of cousin-cousin marriage as we see from the Greek Bronze Age. And it's the largest thing is here on the Greek islands of Paros and Aegina, where 2/3 of all individuals that we tested are the outcome of cousin-cousin marriage. This is no society in the present world has such a strong, one could always say, practice when it becomes a rule. You don't know when. Let's still call it practice for cousin-cousin marriage. And this needs explanation. It's something you can say. Of course, it's less pronounced in the Greek mainland than it is on Crete. and then especially on the islands. But I mean, Crete is big enough that you can find a partner outside your own community, you know. So this is very interesting and requests an explanation. So what does it mean? What could be possible reasons for this very strange and very important pattern of cousin-cousin marriage? Could it be pooling of inheritance within the family, especially when land resources are scarce? You know, you don't share your land, you don't have so much land to share on a small Greek island. So it's important that if you share it between your sons or your children, and then they marry again in the next generation, the land comes together again, would be a possibility. Is it a focus on locality enforced by subsistence practices? Let's say growing of vine and olives that take years until they have yield. So this means that you focus this basically before you don't give away your daughters to different parts. You keep basically the workload, the people at your place. Could it influence the whole picture? Could it be power political aspects? Or some people have speculated if this has to do with the special fertility of cousin or first degree cousin offspring. Obviously, the amount of disabilities that, because if siblings have offspring, there's often a problem that they have often disabilities, which doesn't happen so often anymore with cousins, but they obviously are very fertile in these relations. But what is the archaeological implication? I mean, cousin-cousin marriage could result in extended families and kin groups living together in one household. And this is what you just said, you know, what we see in the Aegean and Kukunares and Paros. We have these large houses, you know, where you just think, so basically courtyards with rooms around, where you just ask who lived there. And could this be an explanation for these large building complexes around courtyards? Could this be something like an extended kin group? And it's also interesting that the focus, I said, was on continuity and stability rather than creating networks via patrilocal or matrilocal networks over large distances. What we see at the same time in Central Europe, where Mike has said in the Lech Valley, where we see 800 years of patrilocality and females sent over 400 kilometers. And the Aegean is the radical different from all the systems that we know throughout Central Europe, at least all Central Europe, where we have started from Germany, Switzerland, Czech Republic, Austria, whatever, you know, but this is a completely different system. There it was important. It was a network-based living, and here we have a locality focused on locality. So when we speak about locality, it's not that there was no mobility. So I will share my insights about mobility too, with a focus on a site in Attica called, on Orbia, on the island of Orbia, called Neastira. And again, excuse for the beamer is too bright. I tried to change, but I couldn't. So in this site of Neastira, we have a shaft grave, in this case of the early Bronze Age, of the 3rd millennium. And shaft grave 1 had 27 individuals that we studied out of 50, and only 5 had sufficient DNA preservation, which is of course frustrating. It's clear that these individuals were buried together in one shaft, so we assume that they are related, and they were buried together with the classical material culture of the early Hellenic period of Attica and the Cyclades, so-called Keros figurines, which is exactly from the shaft grave, and also the typical pottery, so-called Depas amphikypelon, or so-called sauce boats. These are just examples. They were only shirts, but I just want to give you an idea how these vessels look like. Why am I presenting this burial? It's interesting to see that these 5 individuals from this grave 1 are buried together, but they have significant genetic different ancestries. 2 of them, this Neastira and this Neastira individual, look like the Aegean already in the Neolithic. So basically their ancestors have lived for thousands of years already in the Aegean. 3 of the individuals have an ancestry that is clearly located in the Anatolian Chalcolithic or Bronze Age. So these 3 individuals definitely have no background in the Aegean, or at least their ancestors. But they were all buried together. I mean, I don't know if these individuals left Anatolia for Euboea, or if their parents then did, and then of course didn't mix with local communities. But what is interesting for me is that they had different background of origin, but were buried together all in the same shaft with the local material culture. And you see it also from the radiocarbon dating, it completely overlaps. So there's no time difference. It fits very well to archaeological ideas about the income of technologies and also people in the early Bronze Age from Anatolia. And another story which is about human mobility, and by the way, these images at the bottom are from my computer game, is the disputed notion of the takeover of Crete by the Greek mainland during the 16th and 15th century, and this idea that Crete was then subsequently controlled by the Greek mainland in almost a colonial manner. Something that came out and that was recently also discussed in the paper by Justin Lazaridis that was recently published in Science is an interesting genetic difference between mainland Greece and Crete. And you see here, this is Cretan genetic signatures in the early Bronze Age, in the Neolithic, and this is Crete after 1600. So what we see here is that there's a genetic change on Crete. The question is, what does it mean, this change? How intense it was, and how can we interpret this change? What you see here is Greek mainland, the northern Greek mainland, around 2000, in the early second millennium, suddenly had a significant genetic input from what we call the steppe signature, people coming somewhere from the north, northeast, something that has been shown that went throughout Europe in the third millennium and was discussed in several papers. And this also brought together with the question if this is to do with the spread of the Indo-European languages. But what we see is at the same time, where in northern Greece we have a steppe ancestry in 40 to 60%, it is 0 in Crete. And then it's interesting, if we continue, we see that now you have here Crete, you have the islands and the Greek mainland. And what is interesting, after 1600, we see in Crete a split suddenly. We have now very few individuals that still have no steppe ancestry. The largest amount of individuals that we studied from, let's say, 1600 onwards suddenly has steppe ancestry. And we even have some individuals that have a higher steppe ancestry as the Greek mainland and the Greek islands at the same time. So this is the Greek mainland and the Greek islands. And I just heard today, we have brand new data from the lab that shows that we have on the southern Greek mainland already before 1600 high steppe signature. So it's clear that also the southern Greek mainland, not only the north but also the south, would be up here. So it's very clear that there was a dramatic shift of the genetic signatures on Crete from before 1600 and after 1600, nothing that happened within one day, but something that maybe took over 200 years. And I can also tell you something we now started. This data set comes mostly from the area of Knossos and the area of Chania. Chania was the main harbor in the west, and Knossos, I don't need to tell you, it's an unknown site in central Crete. But what we now also included in a new data set was rather local sites in Crete, not the big centers. And there we see a larger continuation of the local signatures, which is very interesting. So we see suddenly that these people from the Greek mainland didn't come as a wave, killed all the people on Crete, and then that's it. We see that, of course, they focused very much on those centers that then also became the centers of the exploitation of Crete, Chania and Knossos, because we see it from, for example, the transport syrup jars. They were all produced in Chania and Knossos, and they were inscribed, this is olive oil from this compound, and this was then brought to the Mycenaean palaces. So this was a transport mode, a systematic way of exploiting Mino and Crete by even labeling from where the tribute came from, and they all come either from the area of Knossos or Chania, and it's exactly the areas where we have the highest mainland signature. So the story is more complex in the end, but I think points to the right direction. So I can now say this sentence. I got the news when I already sent away the presentation this morning, so I need to revise this. No, we know now that during the Middle Helladic on the southern Greek mainland we have steppe ancestry. And the problem, as I just said, that also we have samples that are present here from Western Crete and Knossos, but we are now emerging these new data sets from other areas where we see that it's more complex in the more rural areas. Of course, we have also to be aware that the data set that we have stems from burials that might be by people that have a tradition in mainland burial. So we see the moment when Crete becomes Mycenaean, chamber tombs appear, and chamber tombs are the place where you find burials the easiest, because there you have inhumations, you have then stone chambers, so they can most easily be sampled. This might also influence our data set. But nevertheless, it shows that as we have on the Greece, we have this high European ancestry, and in Crete we have no around 2000. We see that after 2000, people from Greece must have come to Crete, and although we are not absolutely sure how we can model it, I'm quite sure, model in the sense of, the genetic ancestry could also come from different parts of Greece. We don't know if it comes from the southern Greek mainland or from the northern Greek mainland, but what we see is there comes impact from outside, and it means as it has such a strong shift, at least in the main centers, it must have been connected with significant amounts of people. As said, what we don't know is where the steppe ancestry that reached Greece, where it came from, we don't know. We try to model it, but we still lack the possibility to say, did it come from via Bulgaria? Did it come via, at least we are not in a position to model it at the moment. And it's also a probability that this Eastern European origin, on the one hand, that came to Greece and then later to Crete, had different origins. I will now want to shift from mobility to food and present the results for the dental calculus that I already spoke about, where we did proteins, Christina Warriner and I, and we also studied phytoliths and starch grains in dental calculus, as well as lipids and other plant biomarkers. For this context, I will only present a few individuals from Tiryns, Mycenaean citadel from the 13th and 12th century, and again from Chania, the same individuals where we also had genetic data from the 14th and 13th century. We did, as I said, chemical and protein analysis, and some of them are still under work. And one fascinating thing is what our postdoc Ashley Scott found is in one individual from Chania, she found different crab proteins in the calculus, showing that this individual obviously was very interested in eating crab. And we assume that if the crab proteins entered the calculus, it's not enough to eat crab once. So this individual ate quite a number of crabs. So you also know, if you eat crabs here, lobster in Boston, and don't brush your teeth, you see the potential that is lost every day. But just take this. There's things that you can learn from such a lecture, But of course, the other thing that you have in your calculus is also the dust from inhaling the fireplaces. If you make a fire and you brush, you clean your nose the next day, you see you have a lot of dark, things, the particles. And the same thing also gets into your calculus. And this helps us to see what people heated in their fireplaces and what smoke they inhaled. And of course, what you get inside your calculus are unburned wood fragments. So you can really have unburned fragments of conifer or alder in your calculus, in your mouth, or charred particles that look like micro pieces of charcoal. But you really find micro pieces of charcoal in your mouth. So what could we find? We found the inhalation of smoke from burning pine wood, pinacea wood, pine, larch cedar, in all individuals from the Aegean. And I would say this is not a surprise. If you go around in Greece, try to burn something, I think what you would get is pine wood. And we also find the inhalation of burning wood from hardwood like oak, but also possibly olive in most individuals. So far, no surprise, this is what you would find in burn. We also find the inhalation of smoke from burning dung in several individuals, something that wonders us, but it's still common practice in many areas where people don't have enough fuel for burning. So conifers, oak, and dung are usual material in the 2nd millennium Aegean. But what is interesting is 6 individuals from Tiryns and 3 individuals from Chania show the inhalation of smoke from burning lignite, brown coal. This is a surprise because this is the earliest evidence for the exploitation of lignite in Europe and the Mediterranean. There might be one example from China that is earlier. So it's more than 1,000 years earlier than Theophrast mentions lignite for the first time, its use in the 4th century BC. And it's interesting because of the still lignite increases exploited and burned in a lot of power plants. The chemistry of these lignite sources is very well studied to an extent that we are able to locate the lignite signals from the calculus with specific lignite sources in present-day Greece. And what we see is that the signatures from Tiryns point to the area of Olympia. That's also the place where Theophrastus writes 1,000 years later that you can go around and collect these brown pieces on the surface. So you didn't make, it was not too much effort to collect it, but then you had to bring it over 150 kilometers to Tiryns. And the chemical signature in Chania points to a site of Kandanos, which is quite in the vicinity of Chania. So why all this effort? I mean, lignite enables better control of firing temperatures and was most probably used for craft activities. And a lot of those individuals that show the lignite signature in the calculus also have very strong muscle attachments at their right arms. So, but we have it in male and female individuals, and not every individual has these strong muscle attachments. So, our interpretation is that the use of lignite was one of the reasons for the superior metal and pottery production in the Aegean Bronze Age. One should know that in the Aegean Bronze Age, they produced tens of thousands of vessels in proto-industrial workshops close to the palaces, only to be exported. You know, we have vessel shapes, you find tens of thousands of pieces in the Levant and on Cyprus, and not a single one of the same type on Greece, although it was produced there because they only produced it for export. So the problem in Greece is always, if you have such a production of pottery, you need fire. There's no firewood, you know, so you need fuel. And obviously, as we in Germany are thinking, how can we fuel our power plants through the winter? Because Russian gas was just wrong choice. You know, they had the alternative in taking brown coal, which is nowadays also no option anymore, you know, but that's, in the past it was, and it enabled basically the mass production in a largely deforested landscape as Mycenaean Greece was. So we see the relevance for lignite for the craft production, and now we have to think about what its exploitation, transport, and redistribution means from an economic, historical perspective, and this needs to be studied in the future. And I also need to say that archaeology, we also need to think about the ash that we usually throw away, and in the future it might make sense to study it more closer to see what was actually burned. Last but not least, my last slides, and Mike, I promise I only have a few more minutes, are about the historical diseases in the second millennium Eastern Mediterranean and what we can learn about it in Greece. So I don't read this, I just say a few things. This is a letter of the 18th century from King Simrilim of Mari to his wife Shiptu, and I think it's like, it looks very much like what we read during the pandemic times. I've heard that Naaname is suffering from skin lesion, yet she frequents the palace. It will infect many women with her ailment. Now give strict orders that no one drink from the cup she uses, no one sit on the seat which she sits, no one lie on the bed which she lies, so that it would not infect many women, and so on and so on. So you see, they had quite a good idea what infection means, and this is 18th century BC, where you really knew that infection takes place. Of course, you have a little bit of a medical understanding. You also pray to God. You basically combine different perspectives to do the best things against illnesses. And the most famous text of this time is the so-called Hittite plague, where there's so-called constant dying in the land of Hatti in Anatolia. And the question, will the plague never be eliminated from the land of Hatti? I cannot overcome the worry of my heart. And since this time, we are struggling to find out what the so-called Hittite plague was. So what did we do? I mean, I know Greece is not central Anatolia, but unfortunately the number of Hittite burials is very, very small. So what we present here is a view from, again, Minoan Crete, where we screened 67 teeth from individuals from Ios Charalambos. On Crete, it's a highland site, a Lassithi plateau, and used from the late Neolithic to the Middle Bronze Age, and for secondary burial, so you died somewhere else and then your bones were brought there, and the samples that I speak of are around 2000 BCE. And we found in one individual was positive for Yersinia pestis, so the plague, but it was not the one, it was not the bubonic one, because it was in a time when it couldn't be transmitted by fleas. And it's probably also not the one that is transmitted by blood contact. So there's a high probability that what we get is pneumonic plague, which then raises the question how this was spread. What you can see is these plagues of the 3rd and 2nd millennium, what we call LNBA plague, late Neolithic Bronze Age plague, was not transmitted by fleas. We see it here it differs from the Black Death, first and second pandemic. It's something different, but nevertheless, it obviously killed people in the second and third millennium throughout Eurasia and also the Aegean, as we can see here. And it's the first time we can trace it from Central Asia to Central Europe, but now for the first time we can show it also was in the Mediterranean. And we know that at a later time, plague had killed millions of people. I don't need to tell this at a place where Mike McCormick gives lectures from time to time. But we, of course, would like to know what was the extent of this plague in the late 3rd and 2nd millennium BCE. So we have so far zero idea about the scale and impact on the local population. Did it have any impact, And also the question, for me as an archaeologist, interesting that infectious diseases must have shaped also worldviews. You need to explain something like this. And this is, we see the textual sources from the Hittites, we see it from the Near East. Illnesses and death is something that is reflected upon where you think about how you can solve it, what you can do against. So it's something that we don't have the literary sources, but it's something that Linear B just doesn't inform us about this, but it's something that we need to think about. One thing that worries me still is how did the plague reach Crete? Because, I mean, if I infect you with the pneumonic plague, you have high probability that within, I think, 24, 48 hours, you die with 90% probability. So if I infect someone, the person, until she or he gets to the ship, walks up to the city plateau, dies, and infects someone else, is rather improbable. So it's my hypothesis, but everyone can has his or her own hypothesis that it was transmitted by migratory birds, because this is something that can be, in times where we had no chicken, and there's no chicken this time, we know that raven birds and pigeons both can travel over long distances, both can transmit diseases, were the ones that were eaten by humans, were close to humans, and while taking out the feathers could be a way of getting infected. And the ill bird is the one that you usually catch. But this is something that I can only speculate as a historian.
Is it possible at this period it to be transmitted by rats?
I would say, ask me this question after my last slide. Because this is my last slide, where I want to say that I think bioarchaeology enables important additional insights into past life fields. I speak of additional because it doesn't replace the other insights, but it's an additional venue that needs to be integrated and brought together with the other aspects. And we also need to be aware of the limits and filters due to preservation. If we don't get a lot of evidence for infectious diseases, it can be a matter of preservation, and we need to be aware that those people that we study genetically are a very specific part of the people that lived in the past, namely those that were buried in a way that we can still study them. So in the end, it's important to understand the potential of such an approach and work on it and speak with each other. And I think this forum that we have here is the perfect way of proceeding in this line of thought. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Philip, for that very engaging talk, which took us to many amazing places with material that's so new. He couldn't integrate it into a slideshow because the data just came in this morning. The Science of the Human Past and the work of our wonderful researchers at the Planck-Harvard Research Center is really changing what we know about the world of the past, out of which we come. Philip has graciously agreed to take some questions, and the floor is open, as always, to our friends assembled here.
You want?
David. Lisa will bring you, there we go.
So that was a wonderful talk. I had a question.
Just identify yourself for any newcomers here.
Sorry, I'm David Reich. I'm a geneticist here. That was a wonderful talk. I had a question about the close kin unions in Mycenaean in Greece and Minoan Greece, and your statement that that it was sort of unprecedented degree of this. I think there's a few other examples today. There's a very strong example in, for example, places in parts of the Middle East, in Pakistan, for example, where maybe 40% of marriages in Pakistan are close kin unions of first and second cousins. I was wondering, and there's an earlier paper by Harold Ringbauer on Peru after between 1000 and 1500 BC, where there's a transition to a similar rate of close kin unions. So I was wondering if there's a characteristic ratio that you see in the data of for example, second degree relationships that might be an uncle-niece, third degree, a cousin, fourth degree, fifth degree, that would be a second cousin, that you see there, and that's different perhaps from what you see in other groups? I mean, that might be informative and you might be able to tease that out. I don't know.
I mean, for the material, I mean, first of all, thanks for I mean, I just have shown some examples from the Near East, but actually it is from the Levant to Pakistan, something very dominant in these societies still nowadays. Harald thinks that what we see is the pattern only of first cousin marriages, so no more distant.
So it's like a specific type of relationship, because in Pakistan it's first or second, and there's many seconds.
Yeah.
So, and it's associated there, we know, with keeping, like you said, land in the family, right, or in the tribe, right?
This is how I explain it also to me, but at least, I mean, I don't know if there are some second cousins masked, but at least Harald says that he thinks that all of them are first cousins. For me, the question is, again, as you just said, what are the reasons, and what is the reason for the emergence of the system, and what is the reason of when did the system end?
Yeah.
You know, there's a question we don't know how it continued, and it's something that is just unknown.
It feels almost like a religious type of pattern, because like in India, southern India, for example, there are very specific prescribed marriages between uncles and nieces on a particular side of the person's family. And so there, I imagine you might see a pattern of extremely close relatives and then nothing further on, right? So I don't know. I wonder if you could do that. I would be interested to see a statistical test.
Absolutely. I mean, I will discuss it with the further testing. I will discuss with Harald. One thing that you just said, that in India there has some religious background. This is when I said, when does a practice become a rule? You know, this is a very, very difficult question, you know, because at some moment something that is just done because it is always done that way to something that needs to be done. It's very difficult to differentiate, and I don't know.
Well, in India, there's a very specific pattern, like in particular caste groups, It will be like your mother's brother, but not your father's brother, or something like this. And that will actually leave a particular genetic signature of the type that can be detected here in sufficient sample size.
I think Irini even modeled this, but I think it was inconclusive. There was no clear. I think this kind of style Irini indeed modeled, but it was not clear.
Thank you.
And what David's question and Philipp's thoughtful response underlines is that this is producing just extraordinary, this work is producing extraordinary new data that is completely unexpected and shows us patterns that are open new questions that we never thought, we never realized were there. We had a very intense discussion in a meeting of French archaeologists a few weeks ago in Leipzig, and with our colleagues, our German colleagues and other backgrounds in Leipzig, about Avar burials, where these peoples that came from East Asia and invaded the Roman Empire in its final stages in the 6th and 7th century and established themselves in Central Europe. And there are extraordinary patterns in a cemetery in which out of 140 individuals, 138 of them are all related. And yet, in this small village where everybody was interrelated, there's no consanguinity. That is to say, within what is the third degree, where you start to have congenital diseases. Someone knew exactly who was related to whom and to what degree and what was safe to bring together for coupling. There was some hidden knowledge in this society that we didn't even know existed that guided coupling in this village for 6 generations. Quite remarkable. Please, Joseph, please identify yourself, Joseph.
Hi, I'm Joseph Lazaridis. So in our paper, we claim that in Mycenaean Greece there wasn't a strong correlation of ancestry and social status. And I'm curious if in your data from the same periods, you see that there is some kind of relation between ancestry and social status.
What do you mean with ancestry and social?
So there is this, as you saw it in your plot as well, there was this individual that had a lot of steppe ancestry and or little, And do you see that there's any correlation of this type of ancestry with social status?
No, we don't see.
You don't see it. Okay.
What we have from the mainland, I would say everyone in the mainland in the second millennium, what we can also has this be it the children that were buried in this kind of shaft burial in Mygdalia that died at a perinatal age, up to the people that were buried at the Mycenaean citadel of Tiryns, so there's no difference. On Crete, I would now say, seeing the new data set, that it depends very much on the part of the island, and it seems that those parts of the island that were crucial for the Mycenaeans to be controlled had this, and where we also see Mycenaean, what culturally, when I use the term Mycenaean, I mean this is a modern archaeological classificatory term, not in the sense of an ethnic term, where we see that this Mycenaean culture has its strongest impact. This is exactly where we see this genetic transformation, where we have to be, on the other hand, very careful not to intermix genetic terminologies when I speak of mainland origin, for example, with terms like the Mycenaean. So as you know, what we published with Steffi Eisenmann, we very much argue against using these kind of ethical terms for genetic signatures. But we see suddenly, and I mean, this is the problem with genetic analysis. The more data you get, the more you see the complexity emerging, which also makes it interesting, you know, and this is exactly what we see in Crete now.
David, well, please, in the back.
Hi, Philip. Hi, Philip. Thanks for the great talk. This, I guess, ties together the first. Sorry, Jacob Seedig. I'm with David's lab. This ties together the first two questions. So, if 2/3 of the people were related, 1/3 weren't, and for those 1/3 that weren't closely related, do they seem sort of socially different, or were they? I guess, what's your thought on those? Were they coming from a sort of outside community, or were they just coincidence that their parents weren't closely related?
The problem is these individuals were buried in the same context, and what we don't know is, so we see no special treatment of those individuals that are the outside of, also archaeologically at the moment, we see no difference between individuals that are the outcome of cousin-cousin marriage with those individuals that were not the outcome of cousin-cousin marriage, at least not now. Maybe we see it if we have enough data, but this is a really good question to see if those were treated in a different way. So far, we cannot see it. For example, in the cave of Aias Karalambos, where we have half of them cousin-cousin marriage, the other one not. They were all just bones in one chamber. They were treated basically the same way. But this is something that, I mean, what we don't know, and which is also what David just said, and I think this is a very, very important point. We don't really understand the cultural framework that led to this very specific marital rule. And for me as an archaeologist, I want to really understand this framework, but it's very, very difficult. But I mean, we are just starting. We saw this pattern now. It will be hopefully published in a few weeks in this intensity. And now we need to ask this question, be it from an architectural point of view. As you just said, what does it mean for architecture? The question is, what does it mean with, what means, how can we get this more, when we do now biological relatedness, let's say up to the 6th, 7th, 10th degree, can we get closer ideas about how people in such a community were interrelated? There are a lot of questions that I'm not able to solve at the moment, so let's see what we can do in the future. David?
I wanted to ask about that really what looked to me like amazing data that you had from Neostira, maybe I'm mispronouncing that, with this substructured group with a group that looked more like the Anatolian Neolithic and more, I think you said Anatolian Bronze Age or something like this. And the plot that you showed actually didn't seem to support that statement about Anatolian Bronze Age. It seemed to be off gradient. And is that just because you're not including other samples that do show that similarity? Or they seem to be sort of already moving toward the European admixture gradient. So you see there, if you look at Anatolia Chalcolithic, they're to the right of those 3 points.
So basically, at least that's what Irini modeled. So
Yeah.
Irini modeled admixture, and these individuals don't need any they don't need any Aegean Neolithic in the modeling of their.
But are they look like they're, at least from that picture, they don't look like they're in the main Anatolian Chalcolithic, maybe Bronze Age cluster. So it looks like they're deviating toward Europe. Is that an artifact? Is that real? Are you not including all the Anatolian Bronze Age or Chalcolithic individuals are there? Is there evidence that these individuals already have some kind of European-like related or Aegean-related admixture so we've been in a quest for finding the source of this kind of Anatolian/Middle Eastern ancestry that spreads into the Mediterranean, that gets to the Aegean, and that also eventually gets to, maybe even close to the same time, gets to Sicily and to southern Italy, even before, Magna Graecia and so on. And, now it looks like you have individuals, at least at this site, that might be from the source. So I'm really interested in what you can say about where they come from.
This is something that we see. One should say that during the third millennium, so after the Neolithization and before 2000, we see both on Crete, on Greece, as you just said, an impact somewhere from the east, and it's genetic impact. And it's interesting that it differs. What we can see in our paper is that the impact that we see on Crete is from different sources than it is on the Greek mainland. And for the Greek mainland, it seems what we see that the individuals have part ancestry somewhere. It could even go to the Caucasus. It could go to Anatolian Bronze Age. It seems from Crete, it goes more in the diverse direction of northern Levant, maybe northern Mesopotamia. But this is something that is very, very vague at the moment, and I don't want to promise anything at the moment that we can solve this. But I agree with you, and I was speaking.
I'm just stop you there because it's so interesting what you said. So I think what you're saying is that you have some evidence, but it's a little bit uncertain, that the source of this Eastern ancestry is dual in different parts of the Aegean.
This is what we think is that the ancestry came from different parts of the East, and different parts of the East had a different impact on different parts of the Aegean. So this is what we can say now. And as we are missing in many parts of the East a differentiated picture of the local ancestry at this time, and as the data set for the Aegean is very small, it's very difficult for us to model. It's very interesting now from archaeological point of view, because in the third millennium there has been, for example, the site of Petras, where you have individuals that are buried completely in a Levantine custom, where you're not custom equipment, with regard to their dress, where you just think, what does it mean? Are these people that come from the Levant? So can we get this? This is something that I'm very, very interested. Also in this time, we see the fast wheel for pottery is introduced from the east to the Aegean. So it has been archaeologically very clear that something comes from, let's call it the east to the Aegean. But now we see it came from different parts of the east in different intensity, in different locations to different parts of the Aegean. This is something where Ante Tiliakou, one of our MHAAM PhD students, will now work on, because I think this is super exciting. And David, I agree with you, it's so interesting, but at the moment I cannot tell you more than we are in the middle of finding this out in a better way. And I will ask definitely Irene again about this graph and about the Anatolian points. I will do so.
The questions just get bigger and bigger and better and better. Dan, and then Claire, and then Alex. Please.
Thank you, Claire. Dan Smale in the History Department. Thank you, Philip. That was fascinating. Two quick questions. The first, which follows up on David's first question about cousin marriage. Is it possible, I may have missed this, is it possible to actually discern the ratio of parallel cousin marriage versus cross cousin marriage in the sample? And the second question, you mentioned proteomics earlier in your talk, and I've only just learned about this field. I'd love to hear what else we're learning from proteomics on the sites that you work on.
I mean, first of all, yes, you can differentiate in cousin-cousin marriage what kind of cousins married. But it's something that we try, so we didn't find a unique pattern now in our data set. So as far as I remember, this is something that we haven't included in this publication. Irene is, I think, evaluating this data respectively, so I can't give you final results. But it is possible, but for the Aegean, it was not in the sense that we have a clear, conclusive signal that only one specific way of cousins were preferred or selected. With regard to the proteomics, I think I'm the wrong to answer. You have the best person that could answer this room here in Harvard, and you already show the picture of Christina Wariner, who is really, I would say, in my view, the god of proteomics. But on the other hand, I think, I mean, I've the
it.
pleasure to work with Tina, but there's things that I think that are underexploited with regard to those. So the special thing about proteins is that proteins preserve in places that have a high carbonatic structure, so calcareous, whatever. So you have them in eggshells, you have them, for example, you don't have them in vessels. I did a lot of organic residue analysis, and you find lipids, you find other biomolecules, but you find proteins only in vessels that have like a cinder crust, you know, like from a kettle. But this also means that it has potential, and we now started, for example, from these kind of floors, these plaster floors. I'm excavating a palace in Israel, Tel Kabri. It's a Middle Bronze Age palace, and they have plaster floors. And we thought, couldn't we extract proteins from the plaster floors? Because these kind of calcareous plasters should be an environment where proteins are preserved very well. And as soon as they can bind to some carbonatic structure, they are preserved over even millennia. And this is very, very well. So that's why we are now extracting this from these plaster floors that I brought to Tina. And one could also think about fresco paintings. You know, everything that is as a carbonatic structure, you can extract the proteins. And I think beside calculus, which is a great material, there are a lot of things that you can do in the future. For us, what we still need, you know, in the ancient genetics, there was this kind of, when they identified the petrous bone as being the one with the best genetic preservation. And the other thing was authentication of data. In the proteomic world, it's about 10 years behind, and we need people like Tina who really work on authentication, who work on finding out what is the best reservoir that will, I think, in 10 years revolutionize also this field and give us completely new insights.
Excellent. Thank you. That was a really wonderful talk. So I'm moderating the chat, and I'm bringing a question from Aurora Allhouse, and she would like to know whether we know anything or we can figure out if there's a sex bias in the second millennium input from mainland to Crete. And that might give us some idea about the nature of this influx of people from the mainland.
Not that I know. Not that I know that we have a sex bias.
Hi, my name is Alexander Kim. I'm a PhD candidate here at Harvard who also works with David on human ancient DNA. I have a question about that same kind of admixture dynamic that you're capturing starting from 1600 on Crete. Is there kind of a terminus antiquem or like a last instance of individuals without, in your modeling without step ancestry? Is there anything interesting kind of contextually or archaeologically about these? Or do they persist? Basically, are they amongst, is there sort of a point after which like you don't see further attestations of such individuals? That's the first question.
Yeah. So what our it of course depends with the data that is available. So we have on Crete, we have data in the early second millennium, then we have the data around 1600, and we have quite a lot of data of the 14th, 13th, 12th century. So this means that, for example, when I say that here Aposelemes is the earliest point that we have around 1600, the other data points are here, which have 0 step ancestry. So if it's around 1600, if it's the 17th century, we cannot really see there's a, if we would need more to refine, but there's not probably never the point where you have the impact. It's a gradient. What is interesting is that it accelerates to an extent that in the 13th and then 12th century, the step signature on Crete becomes higher in its proportion than on the southern Greek mainland. And this is something that is a surprise, because if we go into this traditional narration, people come from the Greek mainland, go to Crete, and then this is where these mass individuals from Chania fit in. An interesting Chania in the 13th, 14th century, this is the almost all data points fall here. One is here and one is up there. But then after Chania, in the late 13th, 12th century, when Knossos is again finally destroyed, and when we have the so-called, when we see transformations on Crete in the time of the demise of the Mycenaean palaces, we see that Crete gets step signature again probably from a distant and different region that had higher amounts than the southern Greek mainland. Interesting, it's a time where we see the appearance of Italian style and Sardinian style pottery in in Chania, for example, Sardinian in central Greece, but especially Italian pottery appearing in Chania, where you can ask, is this an additional input that came from the southern Italian peninsula? Is it something that came from the Balkans? But this is something that is another story. This then comes into the discussion of what people have called the sea people, you know, that have, where we see in Crete, you need to say around 1250, Knossos is finally destroyed. And then we see that people leave the coastal places and build something like refugee places on the hills of Crete. So you see, in Crete, everyone really fled the coast, which is strange if you live on an island, you know. So, and this is the time where we see additional step increase on Crete. So this is very, very interesting. And again, we would need more data, but the data from Chrosonas and Armeni, you know, this is Armeni, this is the data point that you know, it's from the Lazaridis et al. Paper, the classic paper, let's call it like this. But
Do you have more data, please? Because there's kind of low coverage before.
I would need to check. So it was sufficient enough to be used for this analysis, and I'm sure that Irene did her best to work on it. And the Chrosonas is new data, but this means that one really needs new data also from Crete to understand these dynamics better. And it seems, and so far, and this is what Irene tried, she tried to model if it is all from mainland Greece, it would be conclusive, but it's at least but this is something that the higher points where we couldn't find a clear place where how they model. But from a historic point of view, this is super interesting because it means that after the Mycenaean or the mainland takeover of Crete, other groups of people came in the 13th century, and we don't know from where. And this is something where southern Italian data, where new data from the Balkans that didn't get into the modeling because this paper was with nature ecology and evolution for endless time. So your new data was not modeled into this. So, but this is something where one would need to see if we can get a second, not migration, but people coming from outside to Crete.
Alexander, did you have a second?
Yeah, just a kind of a quick second question. So you have a really interesting opportunity in the case of some of the IBD inferences about sort of the genealogical structure. So I'm wondering if you see this question, I guess, would pertain more to the subset of individuals who are not the outcome of relatively close consanguineous marriage. Are there any interesting assortative or anti-assortative patterns in terms of like the inferred spread of step ancestry, for instance, proportions between parents or between successive or distinct partners?
I think I'm the wrong person to ask these specific details. I think I need to say this is beyond my own competence to give a question to this answer to this question at this point.
Which underlines the importance of, in this new kind of research for us humanists who are used to locking ourselves in Widener and working away in our study by ourselves, of we have to accept the model of the archaeologists and geneticists and work as teams, because the new discoveries that are being made are using technologies and methods that are exceedingly complicated and challenging and difficult, and we are blessed to be surrounded by young people who are much better at manipulating this than I am, and perhaps Philipp is in some respects. And so it's wonderful that the questions are exceeding our competence. That is the nature of a collaborative enterprise. Thank you, Alexander, for that, and thank you all for being here together, live, bringing together what is really kind of an intellectual feast of conversation, of questions. As you know, it has been our wont in the past to accompany an intellectual feast with a physical, material one, and I think that you will all, I hope, be happy to join me in continuing the conversations as a group in the reception that is being set up right now next door for us. But before we do that, let me invite you to thank Philipp once again for having crossed the Atlantic physically to share his knowledge with us.